Well, hello once again, and welcome back to our third lecture for this fifth week of GB 102 Bible Backgrounds. In this module, we're going to be covering those geographical areas to the east and south of the Jordan River. This area that we've been talking about pretty much all week, known as the southern Transjordan region. And this is, of course, going to be the home of the land of the Ammonites, the Moabites, and the Edomites. And we've already been looking at these groups culturally, but now I want to specifically look at these groups geographically and try to plot them on maps to show both their proximity to Israel and their distance from Israel, not to mention their proximity and distance from each other. So, with all of that in mind, let's go ahead and hit the trail, and let's start looking at the southern Transjordan region of the Levant. So, let's work our way from north to south, and let's start with the area of Ammon, or Ammon. Ammon is a highland area. You notice we have it here on our large-scale map, and it's the area that is to the east of the Dead Sea, but to the north of the Wadi Arnon, that very large kind of gap there on the eastern ridge. And so what we're left there is a large yellow section on this map, meaning that everything here is at least 3,000 feet above sea level. And so keep in mind that Ammon is a very highland area. In fact, it's actually just about on par with anything you'd find in Samaria. So you might be having trouble locating exactly where the entire region is, so let's zoom in for a closer look. So there you have it. The land of Ammon there is shaded in red, and it's marked with the box here. But as we noted, the land of Ammon is an ancestral land. It's the land of one of Lot's two sons who he had through his incestuous relationships with his daughters. And it is notable that the scripture goes out of its way to say that this land is a gift from the Lord Israel's God, that he has given this as the Ammonites' possession, and therefore the Israelites weren't to have it, that this was not supposed to be an area that was theirs. But because the Ammonites will constantly fight wars against the Israelites, that will see this land enter into Israelite possession from time to time, especially during the time of King David. So let's zoom in even closer and get a good look on the ground at this area. Okay, so we are scanned in there, and if you'll notice here real quick, most of that area of Ammon is nicely shaded in that yellow, sometimes that kind of bluish color, meaning the area is between 3,000 and 4,000 feet in elevation. But notice the contrast there with the Great Rift Valley, where the Jordan River is flowing into the Dead Sea. That area is about 1,000 feet below sea level. And what this means is that Ammon is going to have a very high contrast with the other areas around it, that the Jordan River Valley there is going to be almost 5,000 feet below where the Ammon Plateau is. So, you know the drill by this point. Go ahead and download your thumbnail maps of Ammon, and we will do the song.
If there's a place you gotta go, I'm the one you need to know. I'm the map.
Alright, so your thumbnail map should look like this. And notice that there's quite a lot of lines drawn on this one. And again, this is a mark of elevation. And the closer those lines are together, the steeper the slope. And so anytime you see multiple sets of lines really close together on maps like this, it's an indication that it's a very, very steep slope in one direction or the other. So, now that you've got your thumbnail maps downloaded, let's mark the 4 cardinal points to the west, north, east, and south of Ammon. Alright, so let's begin with having Ammon there in the center. It's in that large upper highland area that looks like it's kind of shaped like a Y. That's the central area of the land of Ammon. Now, to the west, as we've been noting, is the lower Jordan Valley. And you're basically dropping thousands of feet off the map to travel from Ammon to the lower Jordan Valley. Now, to the north, we have the land of Gilead. And the border between Ammon and Gilead is this river known as the Yabok, or the Jabbok River. Now, to the east, we start to find this place called the Eastern Desert. This is just this huge desert that basically, if you could cross it, you'd eventually hit Mesopotamia. The problem is, I said, if you could cross it. It's actually such a barren desert. Most people, even your well-trained camel caravan, wouldn't attempt it. So the Eastern Desert is pretty much the stopping point for all east travel in this part of the region. And so then, as you head to the south, we have the land of Moab. And the border there for Moab is the large cleft in the rocks known as the Wadi Arnon. So go ahead and pause the video here and mark your map as I have shown. Okay, well, as per protocol, next we'll go and look at the Dead Sea. Now, we've looked at the Dead Sea on a couple of other maps, but this is really going to be our first map where we're going to get a real good look at it. That the Dead Sea forms the southern and western border of Ammon. And this is a sea that has no outlet, and because of that, the water comes in and it evaporates, and it gets to be very, very salty. Meaning that, long story short, you're not going to take up a shipping business on here. Nothing can grow here, nothing can live here. And so it makes a very formidable barrier there to the south and to the west. But notice we do have a couple of settlements, like for example the settlement of Qumran there on the west side of the Dead Sea, and Machaerus there on the east side of the Dead Sea. And another watery treat for you here. This will be the first real good look we're going to have at the Jordan River. Notice that the Jordan River starts at the north and west end of this map, and that it's going to travel all the way through that deep section of the Jordan Valley, and it's going to eventually drain into the Dead Sea. This is the major river that feeds into the Dead Sea. And again, this Jordan River, the Hebrew word for this is the Yarden, meaning the river that goes down. And that's exactly what this river does. It cuts a deep gorge into the surrounding area, and they don't call it the Great Rift Valley for nothing. So the next major body of water we want to look at is there to the north end of the map. This is the Wadi Jabok, or the Wadi Yavok. And notice that this river curves around till it reaches the Jordan River. It starts in the town of Ammon, or Philadelphia, and it travels there to the east and then starts to curve to the north and then eventually curves all the way back west until it reaches the Jordan River. And this, as many commentators have noted, basically makes the land of Ammon is almost totally encircled by the Wadi Yavok. And most of the major cities in Ammon, like places like Gadara or Philadelphia, are going to be highly dependent on water from the Wadi Yavok. And moving on with watery awesomeness, the next major river we want to note is the Wadi Arnon. The Wadi Arnon is the southern border for the land of Ammon, and this is a massive cleft in the rock. It forms a very large canyon, sometimes several thousand feet deep. And so this is a very imposing border there at the southern end of Ammon. And then finally, one more river to look at. We have the Wadi Hidin. This is not quite as large as the Wadi Arnon, but it is a very large river, and it cuts a very large, how should we say it, another cleft there in the bedrock. And so this is going to be another barrier, and the Ammonites know it, and you notice they've put two major defensive cities in between these areas to basically control traffic in or out. And these are the cities of Dibon and Eror. And for this map, we also have one major mountain, and believe it or not, it's not so much a mountain as it is an overlook. Now, this is what is known as Mount Nebo, and Mount Nebo, or also known as Mount Pisgah. This mountain is most famous that this is the place where Moses died. As you may remember, Moses was told that because of his sin that he had committed by striking the rock instead of speaking to it to make the water flow from it, that he was not permitted to enter the promised land with the rest of the Israelites. And so the Lord will take him to the summit of Mount Nebo, which, as I said, is more of an overlook than it is a mountain. And he will get to see all of the land from Dan to Beersheba. And this mountain is technically considered a part of Moab, but for our purposes here, we're going to look at it as part of the Ammon map. So there's Mount Nebo painted there in pink. Go ahead and pause your map and mark all of the mountains and rivers like I've shown you here. So now that we've done water and mountains, let's shift gears here and let's go do highways. And there's really only one major highway you're going to really want to know when it comes to the Transjordan side of the map. And that's this very long road called the King's Highway. This is the road that will connect Damascus all the way in the north end of our large map with Arabia going further south than even our map allows. But for here in Ammon, the King's Highway will start there in Moab, and it will travel north. It will cut across the Wadi Arnon in a fairly shallow place in the Wadi Arnon, and then it will cross the stronghold of Aor. There, it will cross the stronghold of Dibon, and then it will cross through the other wadi into Ammon proper. And it'll meander very slowly through the plains of Ammon, and then it will climb the hill of Ammon until finally you get to Ammon city. Or, as it's known in the New Testament, it's a Decapolis city known as Philadelphia. And from there, it'll curve off to the north and west, and it will cross the Wadi Yavok on its way to the land of Gilead. And we also have another road we would like to note. That's the Jericho Road. It starts in Jericho, of course, where we looked at that in our two maps on the Saddle of Benjamin and the land of Judah. And here we see it again, but now it's on the west end. And the Jericho Road continues across the Jordan River, and it connects up with the King's Highway. And specifically, it'll connect up in an Old Testament site known as Heshbon that shows up every now and then in the Old Testament. So go ahead and pause your map here and mark the King's Highway and the Jericho Road as I've shown you here. Alright, so let's make sure you've got all your cities, because there's actually quite a few cities you need to get there. In the north there, on the banks of the Wadi Yavok, we got Sokoth and Penuel. These are two cities that show up in the Old Testament. Succoth shows up in Genesis 33. It's a place where Jacob settled for a while. And Penuel is a place where one of Israel's northern kings built it up as a fortress during the middle of his reign. Now, there to the large highland area, we have two what would be called cities of the Decapolis. This is Gadara and Philadelphia. Now, as you notice, Philadelphia has a second name, Rabbath Ammon, and we see that as early as Deuteronomy 3:11. This is the capital city of the land of Ammon, and even today it is Jordan's national capital, so it's always been a prominent city. Now, to the south, we have the fortress cities of Dibon and Aroer, and then over to the west side, we have the city of Jericho, and then to the south there by the Dead Sea we have the city of Qumran. So go ahead and pause your video here and mark the map as I have shown. So there you have it. That's what your Ammon map should look like. If you want to fill in some of the secondary roads, you'd want to have a road connecting Philadelphia from Sukkoth, and you'd want to have a road kind of going off of that, going across the Jordan River. This is going to be your connecting road that's going to go up the Wadi Farah, and eventually will connect you with the city of Tirzah in Samaria. So now that we've done our maps for Ammon, let's now turn the corner and let's talk about our three take-home points about this land. What do we need to know geographically about this land? And the first thing I'd like to point out is that the land of Ammon is seismically active. That this is an area that gets frequent earthquakes and it's under intense seismic pressure because the Great Rift Valley is slowly pulling apart, and Ammon is just one of those places that's losing this tug of war when it comes to land formations. And because of that, the land has many rolling hills, carved out valleys, and it's all because the fact that the ground is highly unstable. Now, these higher elevations of Ammon, particularly in the areas of Rabbath Ammon or Gadara, that these places receive adequate rainfall, and so you get fairly decent farmland in those areas. But the borders of Ammon are either desert zones or steppe zones. And again, this will keep Ammon highly isolated and defensible, that basically they won't come out to play unless they're ready to come out and play. Now, our second point about the land of Ammon is that the Yavok River is extremely extremely important to the survival of this region. I did say that they get enough rain, but that rain informs a very large river, and that river is what will feed the rest of Ammon and give it a certain life to it. And so the capital city of Rabbath Ammon, also known as Philadelphia, is built around the spring where the Jabbok first appears above ground. And most of the major settlements that we see in the north end of Ammon, Succoth, Penuel, they are highly reliant on the Jabbok for their irrigation needs. And so our third take-home point for the land of Ammon is that it is a home for Israel's feuding cousins. And what I mean by this is that unlike those places to the west of Israel, the Philistines, the Phoenicians, the Canaanites, the Ammonites actually have a blood relationship to Israel. And that's because, as we saw in the previous lecture, they are descendants of Lot. And because of that, they will do some Jewish things. For example, they will circumcise their children. But on the other hand, they will also worship many of the pagan gods that we see on this side of the Jordan River. And so Israel will be constantly fighting against the Ammonites for numerous reasons, political and spiritual. And the majority of these battles are going to go against the Ammonites. In fact, the Ammonites really won't become a very powerful group to be contended with until the time of Nebuchadnezzar. And much of the territory that was originally belonging to the Ammonites will be conquered when one of the Ammonite kings, Shihon, marched out to try to stop Israel from entering the Promised Land at all. And so the southern areas of Ammon that we looked at there by the Dead Sea will become the land of both the Reubenites, the Gadites, and the half-tribe of Manasseh. And so this feud between Israel and Ammon will continue pretty much from the time that they enter the Promised Land until the time that they are kicked out of it by the Babylonians in 586 BC. All right, so that was the land of Ammon. Got it? Got it? Good. All right, so let's move to the south now. Let's get our big map out again, and let's notice the area to the south of Ammon. This is the land of Moab, or Moab, and this land here, marked in red and shown up in the box, is home to the other set of Israel's feuding cousins, the Moabites. And this place will show up very prominently in several of the narratives involving the kings. It will also show up prominently in David's lineage, i.e., his great-grandmother, Ruth, will be a Moabite. And so let's zoom in here and get a closer look at this highland area known as Moab. And there we are all zoomed in. And notice that most of the area of Moab, it's there on the east side of the map, is mostly blue with a little bit of yellow, meaning that Moab is up in the 4,000 foot area and sometimes approaching even close to 5,000 feet above sea level. That makes the land of Moab a very, very tall, we're talking like Denver mile high tall land. And so you're going to get a little bit thinner atmosphere, but you're also going to get more rain because, again, anytime you have a high mountain, it encourages rainfall, and it also encourages rain shadow on the east side of it. So the middle area of Moab will be fairly well supplied with rain, but the eastern desert and the western slope is going to be kind of, well, extremely dry, to be honest. So you know how this works. I'll pause the video, you get your thumbnails, and we'll hear the song.
If there's a place you gotta go, I'm the one you need to know. I'm the map.
So your Moab thumbnail map should look something like this. And again, keep in mind that when we see a lot of this kind of spaghetti-like formations, what this means is we're dealing with a very jagged set of mountains and cliffs. And so, again, Moab will be highly inaccessible if you are traveling east to west. In fact, the only real way to reach Moab is to go around it to the north and pass through Ammon, or to go at it from the south and pass through Edom first. Okay, so let's go ahead and mark our 4 cardinal points. to the west of the plains of Moab there, we see the Dead Sea. And notice that the Dead Sea kind of makes kind of this little upside down Michigan kind of formation. It's got a little kind of thumb finger pointing down to there in the middle of the map, and then it has kind of a glove area coming around further south. And so that entire area is the Dead Sea, and then the Great Rift Valley is there. But also notice to the south, once we go even further south in the Dead Sea, we find what's known as the Wadi Arava. And unlike many of the other wadis we've studied, the Wadi Arava is completely dry, and it's technically a part of the Negev. Now, to the north, of course, you cross over the Wadi Arnon, and all of a sudden you're in the land of Ammon. Now, to the east, surprise, surprise, we find more of the eastern desert. And again, if you keep going east, you'll eventually hit Babylon, but I don't recommend you try it. Now, to the south, eventually you'll cross what's known as the Wadi Zered, and then you'll be in the land of Edom, or Edom. Alright, so you know how this works. Get out your blue pen and let's start marking some waterways. And as I noted, the first waterway we want to note is the Dead Sea. And again, this is the largest body of water inside the Promised Land. And again, it has no outlet. It has the Jordan River coming in from the north, it has the Wadi Arnon coming in from the east, and it has the Zered coming in from the south, but no water leaves. And so this lake, you'd think it would just keep filling up and filling up, but because it has no exit and it's so hot, the water here just evaporates at a pretty steady rate. Alright, and so our next body of water, and you should remember this from our previous map, is the Wadi Arnon. And again, you notice it makes kind of a split there, and then it comes together into a single river as it goes down into the canyon. And if you don't believe me when I say canyon, just check out the picture on the slide. In fact, many people have called this area the Grand Canyon of the Middle East, and it is quite an imposing barrier to try to cross. Now, our third body of water, and not to be outdone by the Wadi Arnon, is the Wadi Zered, and this is Moab's southern border. And notice that it's also a major canyon with this river running through the bottom of it. And what this means is that Moab, like Ammon, will be highly isolated, and that there'll only really be a group that you can invade or attack with a lot of difficulty, and you usually have to conquer either Edom or Ammon before you can get to Moab. And so Moab will be in a very defensible position, and they will constantly be a thorn in the flesh of many of the kings of Israel, especially the kings after Ahab. And so our final body of water we want to mark is again the Wadi Hadain. Now again, this isn't a major river. It will connect with the Arnon before it flows into the Dead Sea. But again, between the Hadain and the Arnon, it makes a very imposing border to the north of Moab here. Alright, so let's go shift gears once again and let's talk about roadways. And again, the big road we always want to mark when we're on this side of the Jordan River is the King's Highway. And so notice how the King's Highway crosses the Wadi Hadain, it goes further south, crosses the Wadi Arnon, and then it keeps going in a largely straight line till it gets to Rabbath, Moab. Also known in some circles as just Moab. It'll go south around the city of Kir. And then as it gets to the Wadi Zered, we've got, hey, look, another canyon to cross. And so it'll cross the Wadi Zered in a shallow point in the canyon. And then it'll continue on south into the land of Edom. So go ahead and pause the video here and mark the King's Highway as we've got shown. And also make sure that you had all of your waterways as well. Now, our next road that we want to mark is known as the Zor Road. And this is a road that branches off the King's Highway and goes down one of the less steep canyons of the western wall of Moab. And this will go down, 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 almost 3,000 feet into the Dead Sea. And as it goes around the Dead Sea, it'll stop at a city called Zor. And Zor has the dubious distinction of being the city at the lowest point on the face of the earth, at about 418 meters below sea level. And this road will continue on, and if you go around the Dead Sea, will eventually connect up with the Beersheba corridor. And so from here, you can reach Beersheba, Arad, and all those places we looked at in the Negev, but you have to go around the Dead Sea to do it, and that's the Zor Road. So go ahead and pause your video here again and connect the Zor Road with the King's Highway. Alright, so that's our main map for Moab. If you want to add a couple of secondary roads, you'll want a road that connects with Kir, and you're going to want a road heading south from Zor. This is what is known as the Arva Road. And that's going to take you south, south, south until finally you reach the city of Petra. So some people also call that secondary road the Petra Road. But for these purposes, this is the main things you're going to want to have marked for this map. Alright, so what are our 3 take-home points for the land of Moab? Well, our first point is going to be this. The land of Moab is a high-elevation plateau. Now, as we noted, this area is marked in kind of this bluish purple on your satellite map, and that means that the land of Moab is over 4,000 feet in elevation. It's taller than almost any area you would find in the Appalachian Mountains, and the taller areas that reach 5,000 feet are just about as tall as you would get in cities like Denver. And so we have a much thinner atmosphere here, and we have just a very different climate because of the elevation. Now, this area, though, is brutally flat. It's often known as a mesa or a tableland. And it's flanked on 3 sides by steep gorges. One steep gorge goes down into the Arnon. The other steep gorge to the south goes down into the Zered. And the steepest gorge of all falls off into the Great Rift Valley and the Dead Sea. And so Moab is, as we noted, highly defensible, and no one's going to approach from the east because you'd have to go through one of the biggest deserts in the world. And our second point, and again, Moab shares this with Ammon, is that it's a transitional zone, that the center of the land receives adequate rainfall due to its massively high elevation. But you notice we didn't see any major rivers running through the middle of it. And so when you get to the borders of Ammon, they're not only steep, but they're mostly desert zones with these small little wadis running through the bottom. And again, this will make Moab highly defensible, but it's going to mean that Moab's available real estate is in a small area, and they really can't branch out from that either. And our third point about Moab, and again, I don't mean to beat a dead horse too much, but the land of Moab is home to even more of Israel's feuding cousins. Moab and Ammon share their descendancy from Lot, and because of that, there will be quite a lot of overlap between Israelite culture and Moab culture. The languages are similar, their customs are somewhat similar, but Moab, like Ammon, will religiously be very different, that they will serve a god called Molech, and this god often received child sacrifice and was very abominable to the Israelites. And so, like the land of Ammon, Moab will go to war with Israel numerous times for both political reasons and for religious reasons. And, like both Moab and Edom, that they won't have any hesitation of allying with other world powers against Israel when it suits their interests. Alright, so one more gear shift here. This is our third area we're going to cover, and this is known as the land of Edom, or Edom. Now, this is probably the highest inhabitable area on the map, and it's there to the south that we have it marked in red and boxed in. And notice here that once we leave the land of Edom, we are basically hitting southern desert and Negev until you finally hit the land of Arabia, hundreds of miles to the south. And so Edom is pretty much going to be your last stop on this map, going south before you basically hit almost endless desert and finally reach the land of Arabia. So let's go ahead and zoom in here and get a good look at Edom. I know what you're thinking. Wow, that's a lot of purple. And you ain't kidding. The land of Edom is very, very highly elevated, somewhere between 5,000 and 6,000 feet above sea level. And you also notice there in the western end of the map, we have the 1,000 feet below sea level of the Dead Sea. And so this is a huge contrast, that the land of Edom just towers over the land around it. And this is also a land that is, for lack of a better term, a land you travel through, but not necessarily a land you travel to. So, with that in mind, go ahead and download your 2 Edom thumbnail maps, and one more time, for old time's sake, we'll play the song.
If there's a place you gotta go, I'm the one you need to know. I'm the map.
So you got it? Your downloaded Edom map should look something like this. And notice here that we don't have a whole lot going on. There's just only a few points of interest, and even the divisions of elevation lines are a lot further apart, meaning that Edom is, for lack of a better term, a lot more boring of a land than the other 2 areas we looked at. But it's on the list of things to do, so let's go ahead and look at it in depth. So here we have the 4 cardinal points for Edom. Edom is there in the center, and there to the west we have just the Wadi Arava, that long, flat, but deep hole in the ground that is the southern end of the Great Rift Valley. And the Wadi Arava will stretch all the way from the Dead Sea down to the Gulf of Aqaba there on the eastern side of the Sinai Peninsula. Now, to the north, when you cross the Wadi Zered, you reach the land of Moab. To the east, surprise, surprise, more eastern desert. And if you go to the south, you'll hit, surprise again, even more desert until finally you reach the land of Arabia. So let's mark our major bodies of water, and let's start up north with the Wadi Zered. Now, as we pointed out before, the Zered is in the bottom of a pretty large canyon, so make sure that your river goes through the various tip areas of that canyon, and it flows past the city of Zorah, and then finally empties out there at the top of the map into the Dead Sea. Okay, yep, that does it for the rivers. Not much to see here, folks. But when it comes to highways, we got another thing coming. The King's Highway will run all the way through Edom. And so, as we noted in our previous map, it'll cross the Wadi Zered there at a shallow point in the canyon. And then it will head pretty much straight south to the city of Arduru. And from Ardu, it's going to go even further south and head all the way down to Arabia. And another road that we ended up seeing from the Moab map, here's the Zorah Road. And notice we're just seeing the tip of it. It's going to head north off the map towards the land of Moab, and it's going to head to the south and west end of the map as it's curving around the Dead Sea, and will eventually come out in either the Scorpion Ascent or in the Beersheba corridor. And then finally we have one major road that connects Zorah to Petra, and it goes all the way through, meandering through the Wadi Arava until it hits a nice little break in the cliffs of Edom, and then you travel very haphazardly through those cliffs until finally you reach the city of Petra. And then from the city of Petra, you can go even further north to Ardu until you reach back to the King's Highway. Alright, so that's our finished Edom map. As I said, not all that much to see here. If you want to have a secondary road, there is a road that connects to the King's Highway, and this reaches the city of Negla. And again, it will cross the Petra road between Petra and Adru, and then we'll connect back with the King's Highway heading south. So, that about does it for our Edom map. So let's talk about the 3 take-home points for the land of Edom. So, our first take-home point about the land of Edom, and you could probably have already guessed this from the way that we did our map, is that the land of Edom is a desert crossroads. That there are many roads going through Edom, but not necessarily to have Edom be the stopping destination. As we had said a little earlier, Edom is the kind of place you travel through, but not necessarily the kind of place you travel to. But that being said, Edom will be much more wealthy than you would expect because these trade routes coming from Sinai, coming from Arabia, coming from Damascus, they will all go through Edom, and Edom will have quite a lot of luxury trade goods because of this. Now, keep in mind, this King's Highway that goes through Edom is the most important Transjordan route. It will be important in the New Testament. It'll be important in the Old Testament. And it's important because it's one of the major ways that connects the land of Arabia with Syria. And it does so without having to take any of the far western roads like the Via Maris or the International Coastal Highway. So, our second take-home point for the land of Edom is that Edom is a land of red sandstone. As we saw in our first week's lectures on the bedrock of the Levant, this area here is largely made up of what's called Nubian sandstone, and it's a very pretty reddish white rock. And it's also a very sturdy and very solid rock and makes for wonderful building material. But it also makes for very heavy building material. And so what will happen is in places like Petra, instead of carving the rock and then moving it to a village, they'll basically say, here's where the rock is. We're just going to carve it and make our village right here. And so places like Petra are literally just dug into the rock. And this will be both impressive for its size and its scope, but it will also be a testimony to just how stable this area's bedrock is. And yes, I know you're going to be tired of hearing this, but our third point about Edom is that it's home to yet even more feuding cousins for Israel. Now, unlike the land of Moab and Ammon, the people of Edom are not descended from Lot. They're descended from Esau, who is the son of Isaac and the brother of Jacob. Now, on numerous occasions, the Edomites will form a conspiracy with more powerful nations like the land of Babylon. And so what we see in the book of Obadiah is that the Edomites have basically helped the Babylonians conquer Jerusalem, and they've picked off prisoners to sell them into slavery. Now, that was the bad news for Edom in the Old Testament time. But in the New Testament time, the Edomites will have basically been renamed by the Greeks. They'll be called the Edomians. And one of the most famous Edomians that we know of is King Herod. That's right, that notorious client king of the New Testament who is probably most well known for trying to kill Jesus as a baby. This king is going to be half Edomite and half Jewish. And, well, needless to say, his exploits are legendary, but we will get to those here in the 8th week when we specifically cover Rome and Rome's interest in the Levant. There we go, folks. Week 5 is almost done. So, you know what happens next. For the next 15 minutes or so, let's just sit back and let's look at what a good final project for this semester could look like. And today, instead of doing a single passage, we're going to try to hit an entire book with a large scope. So we're going to look at the book of Ruth. And so, who are we looking at? Specifically, we're looking at Ruth, who's the Moabitess, meaning a female Moabite, but also someone who is a childless widow, and specifically the widow of an Israelite man who was living in Moab when they got married. When did this happen? It happened around 1100 BC. Where are we going to focus? Well, we're going to focus on two places, somewhere in the plains of Moab and on the city of Bethlehem over on the Cisjordan side in the land of Judah. And what exactly are we looking at in this one? We're specifically going to look at how God's graciousness extends to outsiders. People you wouldn't expect God's grace to hit, more often than not can hit. And just kind of starting off from a cultural note, I've managed to find one of many pictures on the internet of Ruth, and I noted one thing in common with our culture. People always seem to picture Ruth as pretty. But I find it interesting that for all of the descriptions of women in the Bible, Ruth never has a comment on her attractiveness. It just simply isn't a question. And I find this to be somewhat reassuring as we are in a culture that is often looking at role models, specifically role models for women, that this is one of the books in the Bible that doesn't say that, because she's pretty, she's worthy of this kind of gracious gift that she'll receive from both God and from her suitor, Boaz. That in many ways, her fidelity to God and her fidelity to Naomi is its own set of rewards. So let's set the table with having a table that can't be set. Our story begins in Ruth chapter 1 during the time of the judges, and there's a famine in the land. And as we looked at last week, what are some of the reasons for famine? Well, if you're living in the Old Testament times, the biggest reason for famine is literally somebody is sinning and the land is suffering. And so we find that a man from Judah, a guy named Elimelech, will take his wife Naomi and his 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion, and they will move all the way across the Jordan Valley into the land of Moab. And they're going to settle there. Now, interestingly, this group is from Bethlehem. And you should have already remembered that word lehem from last week when we talked about foodstuffs. It's the word for bread. And you've got a pretty bad drought when the house of bread, literally that's what Bethlehem means, when the house of bread is out of bread. But here we are in the middle of a drought at the end of the period of the judges, and things are going badly for this family. But you know what they say, when it rains, it pours. And within the next 3 verses, we find out that Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, is dead. We don't know what he died from, but we do know that he passes away. And then his sons marry Moabite women. One is named Orpah, the other is named Ruth. And they'll continue this way for about 10 years. But then, somehow, Naomi's 2 sons die. And again, we don't know why they die or how they die. And to be honest, it's not as all that important to the story. What is important is, as it says in verse 5, and so the women were left alone. Now, as we looked at in our marriage and family unit, a woman has really an owner in one of 2 places. She is either owned by her husband, or she is owned by her father. And you notice, in the case of Naomi, she probably doesn't have a father to go home to, so she is literally left alone. Now, Orpah and Ruth are in a similar situation. If they want to have someone to take care of them, they'd have to go back to their father's house. And as they're trying to decide what they're going to do, here in verse 6, we have this very interesting word show up. And it says here in verse 6 that they decided to return home from the region of Moab, and Naomi was accompanied by her daughters-in-law because she was living in the land of Moab, but she heard that the Lord had, now some translations say visited, NET says had shown concern. The word here is this word pakad, and that the Lord had pakad for his people. And what do they mean by that? It says he reversing the famine by providing abundant crops. Now, this word pakad is a very interesting Hebrew word. In fact, one of my favorite commentators, a guy named Spicer, notes that there's probably no other Hebrew verb that has caused more trouble than this word pakad. And here's some of the possible meanings. It can mean to attend, to take care of, to take note of, to worry about, to determine the destiny of, or just plain old to visit. And this is the way it gets treated in most translations, that it frequently has a default of to visit. And this can have some positive and negative connotations, as we saw in our lecture of salvation. Those who are obedient to God's law look forward to the visit. You don't have to fear the boss coming by when you're doing what you're supposed to. You don't have to fear your parents coming into your bedroom if you're not hiding anything in there. And so the obedient look forward to God's visit. They are redeemed, they're vindicated, they're taken care of. Now, those who have not been obedient experience punishment and rebuke, and they are also taken care of, but not necessarily in the good way. And so for this passage, we notice that God has visited the city of Bethlehem, and the famine has finally been reversed. Now, this theologically opens up a question. Will God also visit Naomi and her daughters-in-law as well? And if he does, what's going to be the verdict? As we note from the end of the chapter, Naomi obliges us with her own personal interpretation. She's going to tell the people of Bethlehem, yeah, God's visited me, and the result is I'm bitter now. I left with my arms full. I came back with nothing. And in a world of casuistic law as the Israelites lived in, Naomi is clearly going to be seen as outside of God's favor. They are seeing her suffering, and the first response is probably like, which one of your family members sinned? And they must have done something pretty horrible. Now, interestingly, the author of the text of Ruth begs to differ. And he's going to use the rest of his book to spend unpacking that God's hand is in fact working behind the scenes. That God will also visit Naomi. So, here we are at near the end of the first chapter of the book of Ruth. And Naomi has made her decision. She's going to go back home to Bethlehem. But her two daughters-in-law want to go with her. But Naomi has the moment to talk a little common sense into them. She says, look, kids, even if I had a son right now to give you, you're not going to be married anytime soon. I can't give you anything. Why don't you go back to your father's house? You'll be protected. You'll be fed. You'll get married off again. Your life will be better. But there's a problem. They'll have to go back to their other gods. Now, Orpah makes the decision to go back. But Naomi and Ruth have to stay a little bit longer and hash this out. And it says that Ruth clings to Naomi. And she says, stop urging me to abandon you. For wherever you go, I go. Wherever you live, I will live. Whoever your people are, they'll become my people. And whoever your God is will become my God. And I noticed that she also seals it with an oath. She says, may the Lord punish me ever so severely if I don't keep my promise. Only death will be able to separate me from you. And so I find it interesting that here's this Moabite woman. I don't know exactly what she knows about Israel's God just yet. But she does know that she loves Naomi. And she does know that the Lord, when you've made an oath in his name, honors it. And so, what's going to happen? Well, before we can sort out Ruth's story, we have to get them back to Bethlehem. And let me tell you, that's a trip. But you know what? It wouldn't be a Bible backgrounds class without a map or two. So let's take a look at Ruth chapter 1 verse 19, where it says, the two of them journeyed together until they arrived in Bethlehem. Now, it's easy to gloss over something like that because, okay, so they went from Moab to Bethlehem, so what? Well, there's a lot of walking in that so what. So let's look at the possible ways they could have went. The first route is to go north and around the Dead Sea. And this would take you from Moab to Heshbon, which is about 42 miles, and you're crossing the Wadi Arnon. That's a brutal trek. But you may not have seen brutal yet, because the next place from Heshbon to Jericho is 24 miles, but you're going to go down 4,000 feet in elevation just to get to the bottom of the Great Rift Valley there at Jericho. And again, walking downhill might seem easy, but if you do it for 24 miles, it will exhaust you. And you know what they say, the problem of going down, if you don't reach your destination when you get there, you've got to come back up. And so for the final leg of this journey, they've got to go from Jericho to Bethlehem, which is another 24 miles. And this one is straight up, again, another 4,000 feet up in elevation. And so if I had to sum up this entire route, it's brutal. And by brutal, I mean 90 miles of brutal. It's very difficult terrain, and it has all kinds of problems that we probably couldn't have even began to talk about. It's got desert conditions. You've got to cross the border of Ammon, and you've got to avoid the land of Benjamin. And you're saying, wait a second, why am I avoiding these places? Well, think about it. Naomi and Ruth are women who have no husband to protect them and no father to claim ownership. They have to cross into the land of Ammon, which is a land of paganism who's not going to be following God's law. But if you go into the land of Benjamin, and again, we note that this is at the end of the Judges period, the land of Benjamin, according to the end of the book of Judges, has been utterly destroyed by warfare, and the Benjamites are kidnapping women because they don't have any to marry. And so, really, this story could have ended right here at verse 19. Going through the land of Ammon, all someone has to do is say, hey, I like Ruth. The story's over. Same thing going through the land of Benjamin. You go through that area. If one of the Benjamites see two women unaccompanied, they would go, hey, we've played this game before. Steal a woman you like. I'll take the one on the right. And so, in many ways, Ruth 19 is a testimony to God's grace, that he has protected them in this very long 90-mile trip. But all we see is they journeyed together until they arrived. But you know what? It wouldn't be a Bible backgrounds class if I didn't give you options. And so, if you wanted to avoid the land of Benjamin, and if I were an unattached woman, I would have wanted to avoid the land of Benjamin at all costs. There is a southern route, but it's not anywhere near close to prettier. You start off going from Moab to the city of Zorah, following the Zorah Road. And this is about 36 miles. It's downhill, but guess what? It's brutal. It's dry, it's desert. And from there, you're going from Zorah up into the Beersheba Depression until you reach the city of Malta. Again, 24 miles, and it's rolly, it's bumpy. Hey, we're in the Negev. Guess what it's going to be? Yep, you guessed it, desert. And so, while you don't have the problems of the potentially dangerous people, you start to have the problem of potentially dangerous terrain taking the southern route. Now, from Malta, you're going to travel north, and you're going to go about 18 miles to the city of Hebron. And again, this is going to be a pretty good climb, but at least it's a more gradual climb. But again, it's uphill pretty much from Malta all the way till Bethlehem. And then finally, the last leg of the trip, Hebron to Bethlehem, is mostly rolling hills, but you know, by this point, I'm at least glad I'm seeing green vegetation again. So, notice in either way, the north trip, the south trip, we're dealing with very, very rugged terrain. And again, we're not getting any shorter distance with the second route either. To take the second path, you're doing about 100 miles. The terrain is still difficult. And instead of 8,000 feet of elevation, we have 9,000 feet of elevation. The only bright spot? We avoid the land of Benjamin. So, as we noted in our previous lecture, Ruth, as a Moabite woman, is not setting us up to be the hero of the story. The fact that she converts at all is shocking. The fact that the Israelites of Bethlehem believe that she's converted is even more shocking. And, well, the fact that she runs into a man of virtue during the era of the Judges, when men are doing what is right in their own eyes. Well, this is just downright unprecedented. But notice that in all of this, while the Lord's name is mentioned, the narrator never fills us in about what's going on in the heavenly realm. The author never says, see, God had planned to take away Naomi's bitterness, or, but the Lord had prepared a kinsman redeemer to find Ruth. We don't get any of that. Just like when they are traveling from Moab to Bethlehem, and they travel safely, we have to trust that God is behind it. Now, the scandal of the gospel is this, that A, God can redeem anyone, and B, that there will usually be no objective proof when the salvation has occurred. For example, most of you all, when you were first saved, had private, subjective experiences. Your new faith in the Lord gave you feelings, and your baptism may have invoked applause from the church congregation. But at the end of the day, like Ruth and Naomi, your salvation by faith is an interpretive choice. Since I am assuming that the voice of God did not descend from the heavens at your conversion and say, "Behold, now you are my son or daughter," your experience is one of faith. Faith that you have followed the Word of God correctly. Faith that the testimony of other Christians is true. Likewise, the story of Naomi, or the story of Ruth, is an interpretive choice of faith. And the narrator does not have to tell you that God is behind every bit of this, because the people of faith simply know that He is behind all of this. Naomi sees that Ruth collects more grain than is expected, and she realizes the situation is changing. Boaz acts virtuously to the woman who is sleeping at his feet, even in spite of his mild intoxication. The child of Ruth's union with Boaz becomes the grandfather of David, a person who by our rights should not even be considered an Israelite because 10 generations of Moabite blood have not had a chance to dilute through his veins. Yes, the scandal of the gospel is that it is faith that saves you. Trusting faith that our God is a God of faithfulness and that He can turn anyone, people like Ruth, and even people like you and me, into people of faith and faithfulness, just like Himself. And this is particularly the scandal of the New Testament, that there is not a cloud of smoke by day or a pillar of fire by night to point to and say, "See, there is the God who loves me." No, my friends, we live and move in the promise of the blessing, that though we have not seen, still we believe. And so, my friends, be encouraged. Continue to walk by faith and not by sight. So have a blessed week, my friends, and we'll talk together again later next week. Goodbye. Ba-ba-da-ba-ba-ba! This presentation was brought to you by Frederick Bush and his wonderful commentary, the Word Biblical Commentary Series, the Book of Ruth and Esther. This was also brought to you by Mr. Jack Cottrell and his book, What the Bible Says About God the Redeemer. Additionally, information about the ancient Near East comes from Alfred J. Howarth, Gerald Madling, and Edwin Yamamushi in their text, Peoples of the Old Testament World. And word studies were brought to you by William L. Holliday in his concise Hebrew and Aramaic lexicon of the Old Testament, and by Wilhelm A. van Gemmeren's New International Dictionary of the Old Testament.